September 3rd, 1970, 2:18 a.m. The street was empty when the first shot was fired. No witnesses, no sirens, just 7 men moving exactly as planned. They had one objective: Frank Lucas. The order came from the top. Bumpy Johnson had sent them to deliver a message Harlem had understood for decades. Power does not move without permission. The plan was precise. Corner Frank. Eliminate him quietly. Leave no trace. It should have been routine. It wasn't. 3 minutes later, 6 bodies were on the pavement. No chase, no chaos, just silence. One man was still alive. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked back into Harlem carrying no weapon. No fear, only a message from Frank Lucas. A message so clear, it ended an era without declaring a war. What no one knew that night, what history rarely explains, is that this wasn't a street dispute. It was the moment old power collided with a new system. And what followed didn't just change who controlled Harlem, it changed how power worked forever. Before we continue with the video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In the late 1960s, Harlem did not announce when violence was coming. It lived inside it. The streets north of 125th were already trained to listen for danger, in the rhythm of footsteps, in the silence between sirens, in the way men looked away too quickly. By 1968, Harlem had survived riots, assassinations, and the collapse of old power structures that once kept crime orderly, predictable, and quiet. That order had a name, even if it was rarely spoken aloud: Bumpy Johnson. By the time most of New York believed he was a relic, a ghost from an older Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was still very much alive, still calculating, still enforcing a balance that had taken decades to build. He was not a street gangster. He did not shout. He did not posture. He governed. For more than 30 years, Harlem's underworld had functioned under an unspoken agreement. No chaos without permission. Numbers rackets, protection, heroin distribution, all of it flowed through channels Bumpy either controlled directly or allowed indirectly. Italian families respected him not because they liked him, but because ignoring him had consequences. And then, quietly, without ceremony, someone began moving weight without asking. That someone was Frank Lucas. Frank was not born into Harlem royalty. He arrived from North Carolina with nothing but discipline learned under Bumpy's shadow. For years he stood behind him, carried money, watched meetings, listened more than he spoke. While others chased reputation, Frank studied logistics, supply lines, weak points, silence. By the mid-1960s, Harlem's heroin market was changing. The old system depended on middlemen, Italian wholesalers, French connections, layered cuts that diluted profit. Frank saw inefficiency everywhere, and inefficiency meant opportunity. What made his rise dangerous wasn't ambition, it was independence. When Bumpy Johnson went to prison in 1968, Harlem felt the absence immediately. Crews tested boundaries. Small wars ignited and burned out overnight. But one operation didn't slow down. It expanded. Frank Lucas did not wait for permission. Using military cargo routes tied to the Vietnam War, Frank established a direct supply chain from Southeast Asia. Pure product, no intermediaries, no tribute paid. By the time Bumpy returned to Harlem, Frank was no longer a lieutenant operating under borrowed authority. He was a problem. In Harlem, problems were not confronted publicly. They were corrected quietly. Bumpy Johnson understood something Frank did not yet fully grasp. Harlem survived on balance. Power could shift, but it could not rupture without blood flooding the streets. And Frank's operation, aggressive, insulated, invisible, threatened to do exactly that. Meetings were requested. Messages were sent. Frank ignored them. That was the first mistake. By the winter of 1969, Bumpy Johnson had confirmed what his instincts already knew. Frank Lucas was not paying anyone, was not sharing territory, and was not afraid. Worse, he was expanding south and west, touching corners that had been stable for years. That kind of disrespect could not be tolerated. Not because of pride, but because of precedent. If Frank succeeded, every ambitious operator in Harlem would follow his example. The old order would collapse in weeks, so Bumpy made a decision he had avoided for decades. He authorized a message, not a warning, not a negotiation, a demonstration. 7 men were selected, not amateurs, not young shooters trying to prove themselves, but professionals with long memories and quiet reputations. Men who understood that this was not about killing Frank Lucas alone. It was about restoring gravity. They were given clear instructions. Locate Frank, intercept him away from crowds, and make the point unmistakable. No collateral damage, no noise. Harlem did not need a war. It needed a reminder. What none of them anticipated was how carefully Frank Lucas had already prepared for this moment. Frank had grown up watching men disappear. He understood patterns. He changed routes. He rotated vehicles. He trusted almost no one. By the time the 7 men began moving, Frank was already sensing pressure, subtle disruptions, faces that lingered too long, cars that appeared twice in the same hour. Still, the encounter happened, not where Bumpy expected, not how anyone planned. Before dawn, on a stretch of road most men avoided after midnight, gunfire erupted and vanished in under 3 minutes. No sirens followed, no witnesses came forward. By sunrise, 6 men were dead. 1 was alive, and he was walking, blood on his coat, hands empty, no weapon, no fear in his eyes. When he finally reached the place Bumpy Johnson had ruled for decades, he did not ask to see him. He was expected. The man delivered the message exactly as instructed, not Frank's words, but the result of his response. A message carved not into paper but into bodies. Harlem would understand soon enough. The balance had shifted, and Bumpy Johnson, for the first time in his life, realized that control was no longer guaranteed, only contested. The man who returned did not rush. In Harlem, speed after violence was a sign of panic, and panic was a liability. He walked instead, steady, deliberate, through streets that still smelled faintly of rain and exhaust. Dawn had not fully arrived. Storefront gates were half lowered. A few early risers noticed the blood on his coat and chose not to ask questions. In Harlem, survival often depended on knowing when not to look twice. By the time he reached the building where Bumpy Johnson conducted his business, the city was awake enough to remember fear. Inside, the atmosphere was controlled but tense. No shouting, no raised voices. Men spoke quietly, if at all. Word had already traveled faster than the man himself. 6 bodies, clean execution style. No witnesses willing to talk. 1 survivor. Bumpy Johnson did not stand when the man entered. He studied him. The survivor was in his early 30s. Broad-shouldered, experienced, not someone easily rattled. Yet something had changed in his posture. Not weakness, but restraint. As if he had seen something he was still organizing in his mind. "Sit," Bumpy said. The man remained standing. "He said to make sure you understood," the survivor replied. No bravado, no anger, just clarity. Bumpy waited. He knew we were coming. The man continued. Not names, not faces, just timing, routes. He moved before we did. When it started, it was already over. Silence filled the room. Not disbelief, calculation. Bumpy Johnson had built his power by anticipating reactions. This was different. Frank Lucas hadn't reacted. He had prepared. The survivor described the encounter without embellishment. The sudden ambush, the precision, the way the shooting stopped almost as soon as it began. No wasted rounds, no chasing, no rage, just efficiency. And then the part that mattered most. When it was done, the man said, he walked up close, looked at us, didn't smile, didn't threaten, just said this wasn't a war, it was an answer. Bumpy leaned back slightly. What answer? He asked. That he doesn't work for anyone anymore. The room absorbed that sentence slowly. For decades, Harlem's criminal hierarchy had operated under understood gravity. Even challenges came wrapped in respect. You pushed boundaries quietly. You waited to see who responded. You adjusted. Frank Lucas had skipped all of that. This wasn't rebellion. It was separation. Bumpy dismissed the survivor with a nod. No punishment, no praise. Survival was its own sentence. When the door closed, Bumpy remained seated, unmoving. Those closest to him understood what was happening. This wasn't about ego or insult. It was about structure. If Frank Lucas could neutralize a sanctioned message so completely, then the old methods were no longer reliable, and unreliable systems collapse. Harlem in the late 1960s was already under pressure. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. had ignited riots across American cities. Trust in institutions was disintegrating. Law enforcement was overwhelmed, corrupt, or both. Organized crime survived by staying invisible. Frank Lucas's operation was invisible until it wasn't. While Bumpy Johnson had ruled Harlem through relationships and restraint, Frank operated through insulation. Few people knew his suppliers. Fewer knew his storage points. Money moved through fronts that appeared legitimate. Cars rotated. Couriers didn't know destinations. This wasn't street crime, it was logistics. Bumpy realized something uncomfortable. Frank Lucas wasn't trying to take Harlem. He was building something parallel to it, something that didn't require approval. That made him harder to stop. Traditional retaliation would only escalate visibility. More bodies meant more police. More police meant federal attention. And federal attention was the one thing no one survived. So Bumpy did what he always did when brute force failed. He observed. Over the next weeks, Bumpy's people mapped Frank's movement patterns, not to attack, to understand. Who spoke for him, who didn't, which corners were untouched by his product, and which were suddenly flush with cash. What emerged was unsettling. Frank Lucas was not recruiting loudly, he was selecting quietly. Former soldiers, drivers, men who followed instructions and asked no questions. He paid well, on time, in cash. Loyalty was purchased, not demanded, and it worked. Meanwhile, Harlem began to feel the shift. Old dealers complained of thinner product losing customers. New heroin appeared, purer, stronger, cheaper. Addictions accelerated. Profits spiked, so did overdoses. Bumpy Johnson noticed something else. Frank avoided unnecessary violence. He didn't intimidate neighborhoods. He didn't send shooters for reputation. Violence was only used when it solved a problem permanently. That discipline made him unpredictable. In the past, men who challenged Bumpy wanted his seat. Frank didn't. He wanted autonomy. By early 1970, Bumpy understood that killing Frank Lucas would not restore order. It would fracture it further. Frank's system would splinter, and fragments would fight openly. The streets would burn. And Bumpy Johnson had spent a lifetime preventing exactly that. So instead of another hit, Bumpy prepared a different response, one that required patience. But Frank Lucas was not waiting. What Bumpy didn't yet know was that Frank had already anticipated restraint. He expected observation, he expected hesitation, and he had planned for that too. Because the next message wouldn't be delivered with bullets. It would be delivered with expansion. And when it arrived, Harlem would no longer belong to one man, but to the consequences of a war no one officially declared. By the spring of 1970, Harlem no longer felt like a single territory. It felt like overlapping maps that no one fully controlled. Corners that had belonged to the same crews for years were suddenly quiet. Others, previously insignificant, were crowded from morning to night. Cash moved faster, so did rumors. Dealers whispered about a new product that didn't burn the nose, didn't need heavy cutting, and sold itself without intimidation. Everyone knew whose it was. Frank Lucas never announced expansion. He let demand do the talking. Where customers asked, supply appeared. Where resistance formed, he avoided confrontation entirely, rerouting distribution rather than forcing dominance. It wasn't weakness, it was insulation. Violence created attention. Attention created exposure. Frank avoided both. That alone unsettled Harlem's old structure. Power had always been visible. Men on corners, names spoken carefully, rules enforced loudly when needed. Frank's system was invisible until you realized it was everywhere. For the first time in decades, Bumpy Johnson found himself reacting instead of directing. He still held respect, still held influence. Italian families still answered his calls. Community leaders still listened when he spoke. But respect was no longer enough to control flow. Heroin didn't follow hierarchy. It followed purity, price, and reliability. And Frank Lucas delivered all three. Bumpy noticed another shift that worried him more than money. Loyalty was changing shape. Younger dealers no longer sought protection from old names. They sought consistency, weekly payments, predictable supply, no sudden disruptions. Frank provided structure without speeches. By mid-year, federal narcotics agents began to notice anomalies. Overdose rates climbed sharply in specific pockets. Street-level busts yielded purer product than expected. Informants mentioned Blue Magic, a name that spread faster than enforcement could track. The streets were changing, and so was the pressure. Bumpy Johnson understood federal attention better than most. He had survived prison not by fighting the system head-on, but by understanding how it moved. The moment Washington noticed patterns, Harlem would become a target zone, and Frank Lucas was painting one. Bumpy reached out indirectly, not to Frank himself, that channel was closed, but to men Frank trusted. The message was simple: slow down, reduce visibility, protect the neighborhood. No response came back. Instead, Frank expanded beyond Harlem. Bronx routes opened. Queens distribution followed. Smaller crews aligned with him quietly, not as subordinates, but as contractors. They kept their names. He kept the supply. This was new. Organized crime had always relied on hierarchy. Frank relied on networks. If one cell fell, the rest kept moving. No central point, no single failure. To Bumpy, it was clear now. Frank wasn't trying to replace him. He was rendering replacement irrelevant. That realization carried weight because it meant traditional leverage, threats, alliances, even assassinations would no longer restore balance. By late summer, pressure came from both sides. Italian contacts warned Bumpy that Frank's product was undercutting their wholesale profits. Law enforcement chatter hinted at larger investigations forming. Harlem residents complained quietly about addicts collapsing in doorways, about violence that felt sudden and random. Frank didn't cause the chaos directly, but his efficiency accelerated it. Bumpy had always maintained a principle. If money was made in Harlem, Harlem was protected. Schools stayed funded. Churches stayed respected. Families weren't targeted. Frank didn't violate that principle intentionally, but he didn't enforce it either. His system had no face. That absence of moral gravity frightened people who had lived under it for decades. Then, in September 1970, something changed the equation. One of Frank Lucas's primary couriers was arrested outside New Jersey. Not a high-ranking man, not a decision-maker, but someone who knew routes, schedules, and quantities. The arrest was quiet, but the implications were not. Bumpy heard about it within hours. For the first time, Frank was vulnerable to exposure not from rivals, but from the system he had been avoiding. Federal pressure had found a thread. Bumpy faced a decision. He could exploit the situation, leak information, accelerate Frank's collapse, reclaim control amid the fallout, or he could intervene indirectly, stabilize the streets, and prevent federal escalation that would consume everyone. It was a choice between regaining power and preserving Harlem. Frank Lucas, meanwhile, interpreted the arrest differently. To him, it wasn't a warning, it was confirmation. Expansion had reached the threshold where attention was inevitable. So he adjusted, routes shifted again, couriers rotated, storage points decentralized further. Money moved offshore or into fronts faster than before. He didn't slow down, he hardened. By the end of the year, two realities coexisted in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson still held the title, the history, the relationships, the legacy. Frank Lucas held the present, the product, the momentum, the silence. Neither could eliminate the other without destroying the environment they both depended on. And hovering above them now was something far more dangerous than street retaliation. The federal government had begun watching Harlem not as a neighborhood problem, but as a national pipeline. The war had moved beyond men. It had become systemic. And once systems collide, no one walks away clean. By early 1971, the streets were no longer the most dangerous place in Harlem. The offices were. Federal attention did not arrive with sirens or raids. It arrived with paperwork, subpoenas, quiet meetings between agencies that had previously avoided cooperation. The Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs began comparing seizures across states and noticed something unusual: consistency, purity levels that didn't fluctuate, packaging that suggested centralized control without a visible hierarchy. This wasn't a neighborhood problem anymore. It was a pipeline. Frank Lucas felt the pressure before he saw it. Couriers started missing scheduled check-ins. Safe houses went quiet without explanation. One of his accountants refused to answer the phone and disappeared for 2 days before resurfacing with a rehearsed story that didn't quite align. Frank didn't panic. He audited every movement, every dollar, every man. What he discovered unsettled him more than arrests. The system was intact, but it was no longer invisible. Informants were being cultivated, not coerced. Federal agents weren't breaking doors, they were offering exits. That strategy worked because it targeted something Frank couldn't fully control: fatigue. Men who had followed orders without knowing names were suddenly asked to remember them. Drivers who had never carried weapons were now facing conspiracy charges. The silence Frank depended on was being tested by time, not fear. Across Harlem, Bumpy Johnson watched the same developments with a different concern. Federal investigations didn't distinguish between old power and new systems. When indictments came, history didn't matter. Everyone with proximity burned. Bumpy understood that Frank's insulation strategy, while brilliant, had created a blind spot. No political buffer, no intermediaries with influence, no relationships inside institutions that mattered when pressure escalated. Bumpy had those, but using them now meant choosing sides. By March, federal surveillance had mapped multiple distribution routes tied indirectly to Frank. Not enough for a case, but enough to justify a task force. Wiretaps followed, phone records were pulled, patterns emerged. Frank responded by shrinking visibility at the top. He stopped attending meetings entirely. Instructions were passed through layers. Cash pickups were delegated. This protected him, but weakened cohesion. For the first time, disagreements surfaced inside Frank's network. Not about loyalty, but about risk. Men questioned whether expansion had gone too far, whether the pace was sustainable, whether Frank had an exit plan. He did, but he hadn't shared it. Meanwhile, Harlem began to fracture under the weight of addiction. Emergency rooms filled. Community leaders demanded action. Newspapers ran stories that avoided names but described symptoms too clearly to ignore. Pressure rose from every direction. Bumpy Johnson was approached quietly by intermediaries tied to city politics. The question wasn't explicit, but the implication was clear. Help stabilize Harlem, or lose what influence remained when enforcement arrived in force. Bumpy requested time. What he did next surprised everyone who still believed he operated by ego. He did nothing. No retaliation, no alliance shift, no leaks. He allowed the federal pressure to compress naturally around Frank's operation, knowing that interference would only draw attention to himself. Frank interpreted the silence incorrectly. He assumed Bumpy was waiting for him to fall. That assumption changed his strategy. In late spring, Frank authorized a limited offensive, not against Bumpy directly, but against independent crews still loyal to the old order. Buyouts, territory absorption, financial pressure. It worked short-term, but it created noise. And noise was exactly what federal surveillance needed. Within weeks, one of Frank's offshore money channels was flagged, not seized, flagged, a signal that the investigation had crossed borders. Frank understood what that meant. The window was closing. He began preparing for consolidation, fewer routes, tighter control, higher security. What he didn't know was that someone inside his own structure had already begun preparing a different kind of exit. An exit that didn't involve money. It involved immunity. And once that decision was made, the outcome was no longer in Frank Lucas's hands, or Bumpy Johnson's. It belonged to the system they had both tried, in different ways, to outmaneuver. The first betrayal did not come from fear. It came from calculation. By the summer of 1971, the pressure surrounding Frank Lucas's operation had reached a level no system could absorb indefinitely. Surveillance was no longer abstract. Cars were followed. Phones clicked before going silent. Meetings that once felt secure now carried an unfamiliar weight, as if the walls themselves were listening. Frank sensed the shift, but he underestimated where it would break. The man who cracked was not a top lieutenant, not a strategist, not someone Frank considered essential. He was a logistics coordinator, responsible for schedules, drop points, and vehicle rotations. A man who knew enough to be useful, but not enough to feel important. Federal agents approached him slowly. No threats, no raised voices, just information, dates, times, places, details only someone inside the system could confirm. They let him talk himself into understanding how exposed he already was. Then they offered him something Frank never had: an ending, immunity, conditional cooperation, and a new identity. Not immediately, but eventually. Enough to plant the idea, enough to make sleep difficult. Within days, that man began making small adjustments, slight delays, minor miscommunications, nothing dramatic, just enough friction to create confusion downstream. Frank noticed inefficiencies but attributed them to federal pressure, not internal compromise. That mistake cost him. The first controlled delivery occurred in August. A shipment was allowed to move while every handoff point was monitored. No arrests were made. The goal wasn't disruption, it was mapping. From that moment on, the federal task force no longer chased rumors. They followed structure. Bumpy Johnson became aware of the breach through channels he hadn't used in years. Old contacts inside city offices hinted that indictments were being drafted, not debated. Names were appearing on paper, not just street-level players, but coordinators, accountants, couriers. Frank Lucas's insulation was failing. Still, Frank refused to slow down. He believed momentum was protection, that shrinking would invite collapse. He ordered routes maintained, payments continued, expansion paused, but operations remained active. That decision exposed the fracture. Within weeks, arrests began quietly. No headlines, no press conferences. Men simply didn't show up. Families asked questions that couldn't be answered. Money pickups went unclaimed. Frank tightened communication further, but secrecy now worked against him. No one knew who to trust. Suspicion spread faster than instructions. Bumpy watched the unraveling without satisfaction. He had built his power knowing when to intervene and when to let events consume themselves. This was consumption, Harlem felt it immediately. Dealers disappeared overnight. Corners went empty, then filled by unfamiliar faces. Violence spiked briefly as smaller crews fought over abandoned territory. This was the chaos Bumpy had feared. In September, Frank received confirmation of betrayal. Indirect, undeniable. A seized account he believed unreachable. A route compromised that only 3 people knew. One of them was missing. Frank didn't rage. He didn't retaliate publicly. He isolated, cut contact, eliminated layers. But paranoia replaced precision. For the first time since his rise, Frank Lucas was reacting to events rather than shaping them. The federal task force escalated. Wiretaps became warrants. Warrants became arrests. The strategy was methodical. Apply pressure everywhere, but close in slowly. Let the system suffocate. Bumpy Johnson understood what was coming next. When the system moved to its final phase, it would not spare legends. And Frank Lucas, whether he realized it or not, was already being written into a different kind of history. One that ended not with a bullet, but with testimony. The betrayal had happened. The collapse had begun. All that remained was the reckoning. By the time the system moved openly, the outcome was no longer in doubt. It was only a matter of sequence. The fall of Frank Lucas did not begin with his arrest. It began weeks earlier, when the federal task force shifted from observation to orchestration. They stopped reacting to Frank's moves and started anticipating them. Routes he believed were clean were allowed to function just long enough to confirm patterns. Couriers who thought they were invisible were quietly followed, not stopped. Money that moved offshore was tagged, not frozen. This wasn't enforcement, it was containment. Frank felt it in the air long before he saw it in practice. Meetings shortened, conversations lost warmth. Men who once looked at him with confidence now spoke carefully, measuring words. Silence stopped feeling like control and started feeling like isolation. Frank responded the only way he knew how. He narrowed the circle. Operations were reduced to the bare minimum. Fewer vehicles, fewer intermediaries, higher risk per move, but lower exposure overall, or so he believed. What he didn't know was that the circle had already been compromised. The betrayal from within had not only exposed routes, it had exposed Frank's decision-making rhythms. The task force understood how he adjusted under pressure. That knowledge was fatal. In October 1971, a coordinated operation began across multiple states. Not raids, seizures, assets tied to shell companies, vehicles registered under clean names, storage units no one had ever connected directly to Frank. The moves were surgical, quiet, and devastating. Frank watched his infrastructure shrink without understanding where the blade was coming from. Harlem felt the shock almost immediately. The steady flow that had reshaped the streets dried up. Corners went silent, then dangerous. Smaller crews scrambled to fill the vacuum, but without supply or coordination, chaos replaced order. This was the collapse Bumpy Johnson had spent a lifetime preventing. Bumpy Johnson did not celebrate. He did not intervene. He observed Harlem slipping into a familiar pattern, the one that followed every power vacuum. More violence, less discipline, more attention. But for the first time, Bumpy understood something clearly. Even if Frank fell completely, the old Harlem would not return. Too much had changed. The federal strategy escalated again. This time, arrests came with names attached. Not Frank's, not yet, but men close enough to draw lines. The press noticed. Headlines appeared that avoided specifics, but suggested scale. Frank moved residences twice in a week. He stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time. He burned documents, rerouted funds, considered exit plans he had prepared years earlier but never expected to use so soon. He was still free, but he was no longer powerful. The final move came not through force, but through inevitability. One of Frank's remaining lieutenants, a man who had survived the entire rise, was arrested during a routine traffic stop that wasn't routine at all. Evidence appeared that couldn't be explained away. The choice was offered quickly and privately: cooperate fully or disappear inside the system forever. He chose to talk. What he delivered was not a confession, it was confirmation. Enough to justify warrants that had already been drafted. Enough to connect Frank directly to decisions he had always insulated himself from. The arrest came early in the morning. No spectacle, no resistance. Frank Lucas was taken without incident, dressed simply, expression unreadable. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. Harlem did not erupt, it exhaled. The trial unfolded slowly, deliberately, Prosecutors avoided dramatics. They relied on documentation, testimony, and structure. Frank listened more than he spoke. He corrected lawyers quietly. He absorbed the reality of a system that now operated against him with the same efficiency he had once admired. When sentencing came, it was severe, decades. For a man who had built his empire on speed, insulation, and foresight, the stillness of prison was a punishment more profound than confinement. Time stretched, influence evaporated, reputation transformed into narrative, shaped by people who had not been there. Frank eventually chose cooperation, not out of regret, out of strategy. Reduced sentence, information exchanged for years of life. He survived, but survival was not victory. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson's final chapter approached quietly. He watched Harlem struggle to stabilize under fragmented control. No single figure emerged to replace the old balance. The era of centralized authority was over. When Bumpy died in 1968, the streets mourned. When Frank fell, the streets adapted. That difference mattered. Years later, when people spoke about the confrontation between these two men, they framed it as a war. 7 men sent, 6 dead, 1 message delivered. But the truth was more restrained, more unsettling. There was no decisive victory. Frank Lucas proved that power could exist without permission. Bumpy Johnson proved that order could not survive without consensus. The message that ended everything was not delivered by a survivor soaked in blood. It was delivered by the system itself. A reminder that no matter how carefully constructed an empire is, it exists only until it attracts more attention than it can absorb. Harlem moved on. Names faded into legend, and the streets learned a new rule, not spoken aloud, but understood. In the end, no one controls the game forever.